I started with a simple, almost innocent question. What if the greatest buildings of the 19th century weren't exactly what we were told? What if behind the monumental facades, the perfect domes, and the endless colonnades lay the shadow of a faded empire? A name whispered on old maps and then removed. Tartary. An empire associated with gigantic structures that seem to defy modern logic. Stay with me, because when you start to observe the details, the story ceases to be linear and becomes uncomfortable. It all began when I compared buildings scattered across different continents, not just similar ones, identical in proportion, aesthetic, language, scale, and ambition. Courts in the United States, railway stations in Europe, administrative palaces in Asia, all displaying the same classical vocabulary, the same mathematical precision, the same monumentality that demands colossal resources. The official explanation is simple: fashionable architectural style, cultural exchange, industrial advancement. But the more you observe, the less simple it seems. Take the world's Columbian Exposition as an example. More than 200 buildings erected in approximately 2 years. Structures with immense domes, ornate facades, sculptures, artificial lakes, integrated electrical systems. The narrative claims they were temporary, made of lightweight materials. But the photographs show something that seems permanent, solid, ancient. The scale does not suggest improvisation, it suggests heritage, and it was not an isolated case. In St. Petersburg, entire complexes emerged with impressive uniformity. In Paris, urban reforms produced monumental avenues flanked by buildings identical in height, proportion, and ornamentation. In Buenos Aires and Melbourne, the same pattern, the same aesthetic signature, as if there were an invisible manual being followed simultaneously around the world. The question is not just who built them, the question is how. How to coordinate this global standardization in an era without instant communication. How to transport tons of stone carved with millimeter precision using carts and rudimentary systems. How to erect deep foundations, excavate thousands of tons of earth, and align monumental columns without the technological apparatus that we consider indispensable today. The traditional version tells us that it was abundant labor, discipline, and brilliant engineers. But look at the photographs of construction sites from the 1890s. Small teams in front of structures that are already almost completed. Absence of logistical infrastructure compatible with projects of this magnitude. Where are the detailed transport records? The complete lists of materials? The technical reports explaining innovative solutions? For works that shaped entire cities, the documentation is surprisingly scarce. Now add another detail. Many of these constructions have underground levels that do not appear to be planned as conventional basements. Partially buried windows, doors that lead to layers below the current street level, as if the ground had risen, swallowing part of the original structure. The phenomenon appears in different countries, different climates, different historical contexts, always with the same characteristic: partially buried buildings, adapted later. If these cities were really built from scratch in a few decades, why does so much evidence suggest earlier layers? Why do so many foundations seem older than the official dates indicate? And why is architectural language so consistent, as if it had been inherited, not invented? This is where the name begins to appear on old maps: Tartary, a broad term applied to vast regions of Asia and beyond. In the centuries before the 19th century, European maps recorded this designation naturally. Then, gradually, it disappears, fragmented into smaller territories, politically redefined, dissolved in textbooks. The alternative hypothesis proposes something audacious. What if Tartary was not just a vague geographical designation, but the distorted memory of a highly organized civilization? A culture with advanced mastery of engineering, architectural standardization, and integrated infrastructure. A society capable of erecting, or at least planning, colossal-scale constructions that would later be attributed to emerging nations. Consider the uniformity of classical proportions. The recurrence of monumental domes, extensive colonnades, rigorous symmetry. This kind of global coherence requires more than artistic inspiration. It requires a system, It requires structured transmission of knowledge. It requires a common foundation that predates modern boundaries. Note also the abrupt change that occurs in the first decades of the 20th century. Ornate architecture begins to disappear. Classical proportions give way to utilitarian lines. Monumentality gives way to simplified functionality. In a few decades, it seems that we forgot how to build that way. Or perhaps we lost something we didn't fully understand. If humanity evolves technologically in a linear fashion, why do certain capabilities seem to have diminished? Why do late 19th century buildings exhibit a level of detail and structural integration that today would require complex digital planning? Why, with all our modern technology, does replicating those proportions and techniques exactly become expensive, rare, and time-consuming? Perhaps the most uncomfortable question is not whether Tartary existed as a unified empire. Perhaps it is another. Perhaps we should ask whether we inherited structures from a previous system and simply reinterpreted them within a convenient narrative. Whether the great constructions were not the beginning of something, but the reuse of something that was already there. When you observe these buildings, imposing courthouses, classical libraries, railway stations with vaulted ceilings, try to see them not as symbols of recent industrial triumph, but as pieces of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that suggests continuity where we have learned to see rupture, heritage where we learn to see invention. What if Tartary isn't just a name erased from maps, but the key to explaining why so many gigantic constructions seem beyond modern logic? What if we're looking at the vestiges of an engineering that didn't begin in the 19th century, but ended there? When you start aligning dates, something curious happens. The great cities of the 19th century don't seem to grow organically. They seem to emerge already mature. Complete urban grids, wide avenues, monumental administrative buildings, immense cultural centers. In photographic records from the 1860s, San Francisco already displayed entire blocks with multi-story buildings, elaborate facades, and infrastructure that suggests long-term planning. Officially, a few decades earlier, that was territory in initial development. The speed of this transformation challenges the common notion of gradual expansion. The same pattern is repeated in London, Vienna, and Budapest. Entire regions remodeled with an impressive aesthetic uniformity. Vienna's Ringstrasse, for example, features buildings aligned as if they had been conceived within a single monumental master plan. Museums, parliaments, theaters, universities, all following rigid classical proportions, all with deep foundations and extensive ornamentation. This requires not only money, it requires near-perfect coordination. But coordination based on what? International communication at the time depended on ships, letters, and limited telegraphs. There was no global standardization of measurements as we have today. There was no structural modeling software. And yet, buildings on different continents seem to follow the same invisible code, the same relative height between columns, the same relationship between width and elevation, the same neoclassical language applied with mathematical precision. If it were just an architectural trend, we would expect more pronounced regional variations. But what we observe is almost systematic repetition, as if there were a pre-existing pattern being replicated or restored. Now consider another rarely discussed point. Many of these constructions include complex underground systems, tunnels, sealed chambers, passages connecting public buildings, reservoirs beneath theaters and administrative buildings. In the Palais Garnier, for example, there is a water reservoir under the main structure, officially for stabilization and fire prevention. But the volume and integration of this system suggests something more elaborate than a simple improvised technical solution. In several cities, old records mention hydraulic systems integrated into the foundations, water pressure being used for purposes that today we associate only with basic plumbing. Some documents from the late 19th century refer to pneumatic mechanisms and compressed air chambers used during large-scale constructions. After a certain period, these references practically disappear from technical publications. It's as if one generation had mastery over certain principles and, in the next, they simply ceased to be used. If Tartary represented a previous civilizational network, perhaps what we are seeing in the 19th century is not the invention of these techniques, but their late application. A moment of reuse, a phase of restoration and adaptation of structures that already had consolidated foundations. Also note the phenomenon of partially buried buildings. In Seattle, there is an underground level known as the Old City, a result of the elevation of streets after historical events. But the pattern goes beyond a single location. In different countries, we find first floors that now function as basements, windows aligned below the current street level, doors that needed to be closed or transformed into lower openings. The traditional explanation speaks of gradual landfill, urban modernization, raising roads for sanitary reasons, all plausible in isolation. But when the pattern repeats itself on a global scale, the question arises, why would so many cities have gone through similar processes in close historical intervals? Why is there so little detailed documentation about the massive earth movements necessary to bury entire floors? If a significant layer of sediment covered pre-existing structures, this would imply a large-scale event, perhaps poorly recorded or subsequently reinterpreted. What if this event marked the end of a previous system? Another unsettling point is the scarcity of detailed technical records about the execution of these colossal works. For constructions that would require thousands of workers, tons of materials, and continuous logistics for years, we would expect an abundance of meticulous reports. Engineering diaries, complete transport lists, extensive structural calculations. What exists are architectural plans and inauguration records. The intermediate process remains surprisingly nebulous. Compare this to contemporary projects. Today, every step is documented, regulated, and audited. However, at the height of the monumental constructions of the 19th century, the technical documentation seems superficial in relation to the scale of the undertaking. Perhaps the knowledge was considered so common that it did not require detailed record-keeping. But if it was common, why was it lost so quickly? Between 1890 and 1920, the world underwent profound transformations. Global conflicts, political revolutions, territorial redefinitions. Architecturally, a rupture occurs. The ornate gives way to the utilitarian. Classical symmetry gives way to industrial functionality. It is not a smooth transition. It is abrupt. If humanity progresses by accumulating knowledge, why abandon techniques that produce durable, aesthetically refined, and integrated structures? Why replace complex systems with simpler solutions if the natural tendency would be improvement and not simplification? Perhaps because we were not improving something we created. Perhaps we were only maintaining something we inherited. And when a complete understanding of this system was lost, only the external appearance remained, replicated as far as possible. The name Tartary echoes like a fragment of collective memory. In maps prior to the 19th century, it appears encompassing vast regions of Eurasia. Then it gradually disappears, fragmented into new political entities. Officially, it was merely a generic designation for territories little explored by Europeans. But what if that explanation is insufficient? If a highly organized civilization existed that left behind a global architectural language, its marks could survive even after its political dissolution. They could be reinterpreted as emerging national achievements. They could be absorbed into the narrative of industrial progress. When you observe a late 19th century courthouse, with its immense columns and monumental staircases, ask yourself if it represents the beginning of a tradition or the end of one, if it is a symbol of technological ascension or a vestige of a previous system in decline. Perhaps Tartary's greatest construction was not merely physical. Perhaps it was structural in the broadest sense. A network of distributed, standardized, and applied knowledge on a continental scale. A network that, at a certain point, ceased to operate as before. Perhaps the question was never just about buildings. Perhaps it was never just about columns, domes, and deep foundations. The real question is what these structures reveal about our understanding of the past. When we observe the scale, precision, and uniformity of these constructions attributed to the 19th century, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Either we drastically underestimate the capabilities of that era, or we are looking at vestiges of something that precedes it. Tartary may have been just a broad name on old maps. It may have been just an imprecise geographical designation. but it may also represent the fragmented memory of a larger system, an organized civilization whose influence was diluted, reinterpreted, or absorbed by the national narratives that emerged later. Official history offers linearity, continuous progress, constant technical evolution. But the stones tell another story, a story of rupture, of discontinuity, of something that seems to have been forgotten. If these constructions were indeed erected with the means described, then we need to recognize that the human capabilities of that period were far more advanced and coordinated than we normally admit. But if they weren't, if some of them were inherited, reused, or restored, then the timeline we accept as definitive may be incomplete. Perhaps we will never have all the answers. Perhaps there will never be a final document that declares, "Here is the truth about Tartary." But there are patterns. There are buildings that defy simplistic explanations. There are buried layers, scarce records, abrupt changes in style and technique. And there is silence. A curious silence where we would expect an abundance of details. In the end, it's not about accepting a ready-made theory. It's about observing, about questioning, about looking again at what has always been before us. When you pass by a monumental building from the late 19th century, don't just see architecture, see proportion, see engineering, see integration, and then ask the question that started it all. Did it really begin there? Or is that what remains? Whether Tartary was a forgotten empire or just a misinterpreted echo of history is still debated. But one thing is certain: the gigantic constructions beyond modern logic remain standing, silent, imposing, waiting for someone to observe them attentively enough to realize that perhaps the history we have learned is only part of the history that actually existed.